Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulihi al-Kareem amma ba'd. So welcome to tonight's talk. Inshallah, you'll notice I'm not standing like I was yesterday because today I wanted it to be a little more relaxed, kind of down to earth. I know a lot of people have brought their notebooks. I think yesterday I may have scared people, so now they're here writing things down. But inshallah, today it's going to be relatively intense, but I'm not going to, I don't want to inundate you. We want to have as one of my teachers used to say, we want to have a chat, right, in a sense. But that being the case, I'm not going to, obviously, I'm not going to keep it that superficial either. If you know me, I generally don't do that anyway, which my wife is always complaining about. But anyway, that's a separate story. So inshallah, tonight, just to give you some background. So this particular topic was actually my master's thesis. And so you can imagine that if I needed to speak about it, I could basically construct a whole workshop just out of this particular topic, right? And in fact, my thesis didn't cover all of Surah Al-Kahf. It covered the first 7 or 8 ayat. That was it, all right? So I'll start off with a little bit of background, and then we'll move in kind of ayah by ayah, but understand that there's a central thesis here, right? So since it was my master's, I'll present the thesis, all right? So what is it that I'm trying to now kind of show you guys, or kind of what am I trying to present? In essence, what I'm trying to say is that when you think about modernity as a dominant worldview, that the issues within modernity, whether we're talking about economic, social, psychological, which we'll get into, actually can be traced back to Christianity and how Christianity moved away from the message of Isa alayhi salam to whatever it became. We'll call it Paulism or whatever you want to call it, right? So because of that deviation from the original message of Isa alayhi salam, you can actually trace back many of the issues within modernity, right? So that's the central thesis, is what I'm basically trying to say. And we're doing that through the lens of Surah Al-Kahf. So Ba'da a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. We'll start off with the first ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Alhamdulillahi alladhi anzala ala abdihi al-kitaba wa lam yaj'al lahu iwaja. I'll give you a rough translation. All praise and gratitude belongs to Allah, who sent the book down upon his slave, and he did not place in the book any crookedness. Now before we jump right into it, what do you know about Surah Al-Kahf? Like, is there a significance? Are you supposed to, is there a certain day we're supposed to recite it? Today? Is today Friday? It's past Maghrib. Anyways, we won't get into that discussion. All right, you're supposed to recite it on Friday, but why? What is the purpose? Okay, guidance, right? But the whole Quran is guidance, right? But it's something very specific that the Prophet ﷺ mentions. Why do we recite Surah Al-Kahf on Friday? Who knows? Yeah. Okay, sure. It serves as a light from Friday to Friday. What else? Thank you. Protection from Al-Masih Dajjal, right? Now the thing is, when you think about the time frame that we're in, are we closer to the Day of Judgment than we were 3 hours ago? Yes. From between last week and this week. Between last month and this month. All right? So the point is that no doubt we are heading in the direction that's getting closer and closer to the time of the manifestation or the appearance of Al-Masih Dajjal. That's we can agree upon that. Just how time works, unless time works in a different, alternate universe or something. But we can agree upon that. So there is something about this particular surah that the Prophet ﷺ is stressing, that we read it in order to protect ourselves. So obviously there's a spiritual protection, but there is definitely something involved in the meaning of the ayat. And that's kind of what I want to focus on, because when you think about the term Al-Masih Ad-Dajjal, first of all, Al-Masih, who else has this title? Isa alayhi salam. So clearly there is a connection between Isa alayhi salam and events that are going to happen or start to happen as we move closer and closer to the Day of Judgment, right? And what I'm trying to say is that there is some sort of a link between Isa alayhi salam, Christianity, and modernity, as we're going to see inshallah. Okay? So, first off, This surah comes after which surah? Surah Al-Isra. Okay. How does Surah Al-Isra start? Subhanalladhi, right? Asra bi abdihi. So, Subhan, when you say Subhanallah versus Alhamdulillah, these are two interesting terms that if you juxtapose, one has to do with, when you say Subhanallah, you're saying we are elevating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala above any sort of defect. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we say Subhanallah, Allah is free from any sort of defect. So it's like we're negating the negative. But when you say Alhamdulillah, you are affirming the positive, right? So when you say Alhamdulillah, you're saying all praise is due to Allah. So we praise Him and we are grateful to Him for what? We're grateful for all His blessings, but we praise Him for who He is. So there's thana and shukr, as we know in hamd. So you have this kind of link between Surah Al-Isra and Surah Al-Kahf. Also, at the end of Surah Al-Isra, you have قُلِ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ. It ends like that, and the very next surah starts, Alhamdulillahi alladhi. Okay, so, all praise due to Allah, sent the book down upon His slave, and He did not place in it any iwaj. So when we talk about something that is iwaj is like a type of crookedness. It can also refer to a type of like physical defect. So if someone has a type of limp or something like that, there's an iwaj. But also, it refers to something that is not, let's say, philosophically clear. It's problematic. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking away any sort of unclarity from His book. But now if we want to juxtapose that to something like, let's say, the Bible. Okay? Now the other night I didn't quote the Bible at all, right? On purpose. You can ask me about why later. But there is an interesting, since we are talking about crookedness and how there's this kind of this things that are not clear. Anyone ever heard of Epimenides' paradox? Okay. So Epimenides' paradox is what it says is a type of paradox that's actually found in the Bible. So there's a chapter in the Bible called the Book of Titus. Okay? This is a letter that was written by Paul. Paul is the kind of the main figure within Christianity, and he wrote many letters to his disciples. So in this letter called, it's in the book of Titus, he writes to one of his disciples, and he says to him, he's talking about a certain group of people called Cretans. So he says that one of the Cretans has said, all Cretans are liars, and he spoke the truth. I want you to think about that just for a second. Why does that sound problematic? One of the Cretans said, all Cretans are liars, and he spoke the truth. No, but the problem is, it's you can't get out of it. If all Cretans are liars, and a Cretan said this, so if he said it, it's a lie. But if it's a lie, it means it's true. But if it's true, it means it's a lie, and round and round and round and round you go. It's what's known as Epimenides' paradox. What I like to look at as iwaj, right? It's just, you can't do anything with it. You have to just leave it alone, right? So when you look at, let's say, other books that claim to be from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, undoubtedly you're going to find certain problems in it, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is freeing the Quran from that. You will not find these type of things within the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then continues, qayyiman, that this is a book that is not only upright, but it causes its reader to also be upright. So when you think about all of the issues that are in society today, right? You think about familial issues, societal issues, economic issues. The book itself is free of iwaj. It's free of any sort of, crookedness, deviance. It itself is upright, and it causes the reader to be upright. How so? Because it gives you clarity in those fundamental issues we were talking about last night, those existential questions. Why are we here? How do we get here? What happens when we die? Without these fundamentals, no matter how much money, no matter how much, whatever, any sort of delights that you have, they can never fill that existential hole. And the Quran is what allows you to basically go through all of life in a way that is qayyiman, right? You're upright. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِيُنذِرَ بَأْسًا شَدِيد. Now, ba's here it can refer to war, or more so the after effects of war. And this is where it's going to get very interesting. Because when you think about what happens after a war, what are some of the effects? When people come back from war, yeah. Hunger, okay, so there's an economic effect. All right, what else? Trauma, right? When soldiers come back, they have this type of PTSD. So there's traumatic effects. Anything else? Thank you. Bismillah. Loss of life, exactly. There are certain psychological, social, and economic effects. And what we're going to see is that when you put modernity under a microscope, people throughout society are suffering through those effects, right? On a psychological level, on a societal level, and on an economic level. But we're going to develop that as we go, bi'idhnillah. Okay, so continuing on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that it remains upright. I don't know if I gave the translation now, but it remains upright so that the book may warn of an intense war, especially from God, right? وَيُبَشِّرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الَّذِينَ يَعْمَلُونَ الصَّالِحَاتِ, that it is, and it is to send good news to the believers, those who act righteously, that they are going to have a great compensation, ajran hasana. The next ayah continues, and I'm moving through this a bit quickly for a certain reason. مَاكِثِينَ فِيهِ أَبَدًا, and they will be in this place, this paradise, forever. Now let me stop here for a second. You know, if you ever talk to kids, they're very honest, okay? So I remember I was having a conversation with one of my kids when they were young, right? And so I think it was my daughter. She came up to me and she says, you know, Baba, we're learning about Jannah in school. I said, okay, that's nice. She said, you know, there's so many things that we do that's so much fun, right? We like to go here, do that, and I play, and so on and so forth. But when I hear about Jannah, it just seems boring, right? I mean, children, right? They're honest. They have no filters. So I was like, why does it seem boring? Well, what do you mean? Like, you get anything you want, right? But you see, in her mind, what she was thinking is that when I get anything I want, or when I get something in this world, let's say, eventually she's not thinking of it in these terms, but I'm explaining it, right? So obviously she's not using this terminology. When I'm using something, or I'm enjoying something, its utility goes down. It decreases. Meaning, if I really want this bottle of water, and if I drink one whole bottle, the enjoyment I get with the first bottle compared to like the 15th bottle, well, probably I wouldn't get to 15 bottles, right? But to like the third or fourth bottle is going to be drastically different. I will enjoy the first bottle, but the second bottle I have less enjoyment and less enjoyment and less enjoyment. So the utility of anything that you have in this temporary world is always going to go down, right? Now the term makith actually refers to the phenomena of the exact opposite, right? When you buy something new, let's say, you know, you buy a new car, all right? And, you know, when you first buy it, you show it off, right? I mean, maybe not in an arrogant way, but, you know, you want people to see your car and be like, yo, man, you got a new set of wheels. That's what's up. And you're like, yeah, man, check it out. Leather seats. You know, it's nice, brand new. I just got it. And you're you know, and people are sitting. It's great. But what happens after like a year? Someone comes and is like, hey, did you get a new car? It's like, yeah, it's all right. Right? Yeah, maybe. I'm glad I got it on lease. I'm going to get another one, right? If you could capture that feeling, that initial feeling that you got, the excitement of having that new car or a new house or whatever it might be, and put it in a bottle, and every time it starts going down, you could drink from that bottle and all of a sudden you get that feeling again, except the difference is that you wouldn't only get that feeling, you would get a feeling that's even better than that. That is makithina fi abada. You will be in a state where every time you enjoy something, the next thing will be even more enjoyable. And that's going to last how long? Abadan. It's going to be forever, right? So when you think about Jannah, it is absolutely pure bliss. No sorrow, no issues, nothing. And every moment is more enjoyable than the moment before that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that they will be in this paradise, in this state, forever. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيُنذِرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا. So who, actually let me translate it because I'm assuming that, okay. And it came to warn those who says that Allah has taken a son. Okay, who do you think this is talking about? The Christians, the quintessential people that make the claim that Allah has taken a son, are going to be the Christians. And this is where, like I said, it's going to start getting interesting. مَا لَهُمْ بِهِ مِنْ عِلْمٍ وَلَا لِآبَائِهِمْ كَبُرَتْ كَلِمَةً تَخْرُجُ مِنْ أَفْوَاهِهِمْ. Okay, so they have no knowledge of it whatsoever, nor their ancestors. What an enormity, right? This is a kalima, kaburat kalimatan. It is such an enormity that comes out of their mouths, but they say nothing but a lie. Now stop here. We're going to spend a few minutes on this particular part. First off, the claim that now deviates Christians from pure Tawheed, you can say is centralized on this particular claim, that Allah has taken a son. Okay? This particular claim has certain, what we call, historical ramifications. So if we go to the very get-go, to the very beginning, and this is where some of the intellectual history starts, Isa alayhi salam comes about, or is given prophet, or is born in a time which is known as, that time of Hellenization. Hellenization refers to this type of, to make it into, modern parlance, Greekization. In other words, the language that's spoken is Greek. The empire is the Roman Empire. And people have various gods and things like that they worship. This type of Greekization, right, and it's called Hellenization, is exported across the entire Roman Empire. So you have certain cultural aspects that are part of the entire empire that start to influence the Jews of this empire. So in fact, the Torah, what you might say, that was recited for so long in Hebrew, gets translated during this period of Hellenization into Greek. And eventually the Hebrew itself is lost. So that Greek translation is the primary text that the Jews are using, which the Christians eventually start to use as well, until you get to the Protestants who say, no, we want to go back to the original Hebrew, which, Allahu Alam, how they get there. But that's a separate issue. Okay? So in this period of Hellenization, there's many aspects that are imported by people who are, let's say, Ahlul Kitab, for specifically the Jews. So for instance, the gymnasium, it literally is translated as a place where naked boys come together to play sports. Literally. Now I don't want that to stop the brothers from going to the gym. Obviously it has a different connotation now. But in those days, that's how they would compete. That's how they had this type of very lewd culture where men would come, older men would come, they would watch all of these sports and things like that. But this was part of the culture of Hellenization. So Greek is the primary language. Some researchers even say that Isa alayhi salam not only spoke Aramaic, but also spoke Greek. There is a theory out there that kind of tries to show this. Whether it's right or not, Allahu Alam, I don't know. So, in this period of Hellenization, eventually what happens is the people that are following Isa alayhi salam, they are very few in number. One thing we have to realize is that Isa alayhi salam was not commanded to take the message and make it universal, right? Because we know Rasulam ilam Bani Israel, that he was a messenger sent to Bani Israel. What the Bible even says, and again, I would question its veracity, but even the Bible says, I've only been sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So the idea is there was never any sort of kind of move to, like how we say, make da'wah and make it common. It was more of like an internal movement that we say we're going to now, teach the children of Israel and so on and so forth. Now, this is a small group that gets quite heavily persecuted in the Roman Empire. And it stays like this for a good 200 to 300 years until you have Constantine, who now accepts Christianity. But in this 200-300 years, Christianity itself goes through a number of phases. They go into what's known as Christology. In other words, figuring out, trying to understand the relationship between who is Jesus and who is God. Is he the Son of God? Is he God himself? Is he, what they call co-substantial? Is he one and the same thing? So there are many discussions in this 200-300 period. There were people are going back and forth. And by and large, you can say there's two kind of camps that get formed. One camp is what we have is today is your typical Trinitarian camp. Your other camp is relatively closer to Tawheed. It's not an exact one-on-one match, but it's close. And that's the camp of what's known as Arius. So a man named Arius says that basically Isa alayhi salam, or Jesus, was not God, was not the same substance as God. He was different, right? Yet, so God is of a divine substance, Isa alayhi salam is a different substance. Now let me just give you a kind of a tangential point here. Many of you might be familiar with the hadith talking about the journey of Salman al-Farisi. People have you heard this hadith? It's very long. How many people know the story of how Salman al-Farisi became Muslim? Okay, more or less. Okay, so most people know it. One of the things that you'll notice in that particular hadith, which is very interesting, is that Salman al-Farisi is, is in a time which is contemporary to the Prophet ﷺ. Meaning, at this time, the Byzantium Empire is one of the superpowers. In fact, we know this even from the Quran, right? You have the Persian Empire and the Byzantium Empire. So Christianity as a worldview is quite dominant by this time. Yet, when you look at that particular hadith, Salman al-Farisi, when he starts his journey, remember, he's coming from a household of fire worshippers. And so he passes by a type of church. He sees a Christian in there, a Christian leader, right? A bishop. And he sees his worship and he gets attracted to that. Now, to make the long story short, because it is very long, he goes home to his father. His father basically says, his father sent him out to do something. He never did it. He comes home. He tells his father, you know what? I think their way of worship is better than our way of worship. So his father imprisons him. Eventually, he escapes and heads up to, let's say, Damascus, right? He goes there because the particular bishop in the initial church tells him there's a man in Damascus, you can go there and study with him. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that transpire where he has to leave that person and he goes to another person in another part of Iraq. But every single bishop he goes to has a certain statement that he makes, which is a very interesting statement and one that, we have to figure out how does it fit in the entire global understanding of what's going on. That statement is that the bishop says to Salman al-Farisi on every occasion, there are very few of us that are remaining. Okay, but that's a strange statement. Because remember, this is the heyday of the Byzantium Empire. Why would they say there's very few of us remaining? Well, there's certain scholars, specifically out of the subcontinent, who said the reason they said that was because they were actually not following Trinitarian Christianity, what had been brought about by Irenaeus. That's another story. But rather, they were following the way of Arius, right, or Arianism, not the Arian, not with a Y, with an I. All right, it's an important distinction. All right, so they were following Arianism, which was closer to Tawheed, and so that's why they kept saying there's very few of us, because once you have kind of how do we figure out our theology amongst the Christians, eventually Trinitarianism wins out. As we know today, most Christians are Trinitarian. In other words, they believe that God is three in one at the same time. Okay? So, there's a certain presence of Arians, and so many scholars say that the people that Salman al-Farisi was engaged with were not Trinitarian Christians, but rather they were Arian Christians. Okay? Anyways, that's a bit of a tangent. Let's come back. So for 200-300 years, Christians are being persecuted, people that believe in Isa alayhi salam, and in these 200-300 years, they're having deep discussions about the relationship. How do we understand Isa alayhi salam? How do we understand God? What is the relationship between them? Eventually, in the 4th century, Constantine comes up. He's one of the you can say the leaders of the empire, and he, to keep a long story short, adopts Christianity. His mother was a Christian. He's on some sort of battle. He sees some sort of, the story goes that he sees the cross floating in the sky, or the shield with a cross on it floating in the sky. He sees it as a sign. He has victory over his enemies. He adopts Christianity. But he's adopted a major problem, okay? Because remember, up to this point, there's a lot of disagreement in terms of Christology. How do we understand this relationship? So he calls a council, the one that all the du'at here I'm sure are familiar with, which is which council? The Council of Nicaea. All the du'at love this one, right? The 325, they have the year memorized, even though there are a number of councils that led up to it. But anyway, so in the Council of Nicaea, you have Irenaeus, who's basically the person that's trying to, substantiate the claim that God is three in one at the same time. Isa alayhi salam. In fact, it's not even three in one at the same time. It's basically that Jesus is the Son of God, the literal Son of God, in substance as well. Arius and his followers are also there. They basically have, they have a back and forth. Irenaeus wins. Trinitarianism is basically dominant, right? And again, I'm simplifying this. Arianism is still alive and kicking in certain parts. I'll give you another example. When the Visigoths were in Spain early on, they had adopted Arian Christianity. And they were persecuting Trinitarian Christians. When they were doing this, and they were persecuting Jews, it was at this point that some of the Jews and the Trinitarian Christians, I'm using that term a bit loosely, sent a message to Musa ibn Nusayr in North Africa. And this is the point where that the entire Muslim Spain story starts, right? Where now he gets sent a letter, that the Jews are calling for help. The Arian Christians are persecuting Trinitarian Christians and Jews violently. So please come help us. That's when he commissions Zayd bin Tariq, sends him over into Spain, and that's the starting point of Muslim Spain, okay? The point is, who was the ruler of Spain at that time? His name was King Roderick, who was of the Arian persuasion. So Arianism hadn't just died out because of the 325 the council at that time, right? Council of Nicaea. It was still remnant. In fact, some scholars also say that Najashi was of the Arian persuasion, right? Because of his quick acceptance of, the Prophet ﷺ and his message and so on and so forth. Anyway, so what happens now is that there are certain concepts. We fast forward to the 6th century, and the ruler now is a man by the name of Justinian. Now, all of these discussions that are happening, this is causing a lot of division in the empire. How do we understand Jesus? What is the relationship? What are we supposed to do? And you find that in order to kind of consolidate the empire, he now starts to outlaw having philosophical and theological discussions. And so he takes a number of steps to do this. Number one, these discussions are banned, and the only people that can speak about these matters are people who are affiliated with the church, specifically the Pope. Okay? Number two, anyone speaking about these matters will either be killed, will be banished from the kingdom. Well, those are the two options, basically, right? So what happens is that sort of rigorous discussion that was happening before this, all of a sudden comes to an end. And certain consequences arise from this. What are some of the consequences? Well, number one, the very theology of Christianity runs antagonist to the intellect. To say that God is one and three at the same time, there is no way to square that circle. Number two, and perhaps the more damaging one, is the fact that any reference to law is completely negated. Because if you know anything about Christianity, they say the law is not important. That's why in the debate the other night is like, why are you dependent on deeds? So deeds of themselves, because Jesus came, died for the sins of humanity, deeds become very unimportant. So there's no need for any sort of a law. In fact, the law is the previous people, right? The Israelites are the ones that had to follow the law, but because Jesus came and died for our sins, we don't have to follow a law. So they have now been effectively cut off from intellectual discussions and the intellect itself, and cut off from a system of laws, effectively. This is kind of the effect. Now, once you have an empire, you cannot just jettison laws. You can't just throw laws and say, okay, we don't have to worry about laws. You still have to run an empire. Who now has the authority to publish law? Well, one was Justinian, but Justinian gets that authority from the Pope. And so now, both theology and, you can say, the Sharia or law is in the hands of the church and in the hands of the Pope. The Pope is considered ma'soom. In other words, he cannot make any mistakes. Any sort of commands that he gets, those come straight from God, and he cannot make any mistakes. So whatever he decrees, that basically it goes. It's the law of the land. Second, he now has the power to forgive. So if you want forgiveness, you would go to the Pope. Number 3, the church as an institution is the one that will dictate what is true and what is not true, whether it makes sense or not. So what you find is that Christian theology becomes a type of dogma. It becomes not something that penetrates the heart and that you believe, but it becomes like a pledge. I pledge to believe, even though it may not make sense, but I just make this pledge, right? So now, as time moves on, you find that Europe starts to enter in what's known as the Dark Ages, right? And some modern scholars don't like, saying that the Dark Ages, because there was certain theologians that developed a lot of, ideas and so on. But for our kind of shorthand, we'll say that there's the Dark Ages. These Dark Ages come upon Christianity for reasons that have to do with how Christianity evolved. So first and foremost, remember I said that you are talking about a period of Hellenization, Greco-Roman thought. Early Christianity starts to adopt certain concepts from Platonism, from Plato. One of those concepts that Plato develops is what he calls the allegory of the cave. And this allegory of the cave, what he says is, if you can imagine that there is a higher form of ideals and ideas, and then there's the world with your body. And the form of ideas and ideals are going to be at a higher level because they're closer to truth. And so he comes up with what's known as the allegory of the cave. So he says that it's like you can imagine these people that are in a cave, there's a fire behind them, and they're seeing shadows on a wall. And so all they're perceiving are the shadows. But the reality, the realm of ideas and thought, that's actually, if a person can escape the cave, then he can see reality. But those ideals are not material. Now, why is this important? Because the idea now becomes you have a hierarchy. Things that are ethereal, that are related to like ideas, that are not material, are considered at a higher and a better status. This gets imported into Christianity. So certain theologians like Tertullian is one of them, and a few others start using, even though they may speak against it, they start using ideas from Platonism. And this is one of the key ideas. This idea now starts to formulate and inform how they're going to now understand cosmology, how they're going to understand human relationships. So one of the main kind of, one of the highest ideals in Christianity, let's say Catholicism, is celibacy. To not get married, to not have marital relations. Why would that become the highest ideal? It was because of these ideas from Platonism, which said that ideas and the higher realm of ideals and ideas, that which is non-material, is good, righteous, and so on. Anything to do with the material world is necessarily evil. So interactions between a husband and a wife, evil. Lust, evil. Relationships, evil. In fact, it got to such an extent that they started to classify fruits and vegetables with this moral hierarchy. So they started to say there's a concept where they said that potatoes were called the devil's apple. Why? Because you get potatoes from the ground as opposed to apples, which are from the tree. So because there's an actual physical distance, that which is higher is better. So the realm of angels, the realm of the soul, the realm obviously of God, those things are ethereal, they're high. Anything related to the world, the body, the flesh, the earth is necessarily evil. Now this is how the cosmology is formed, okay? With this cosmology, you find that this is why they enter into the Dark Ages in the first place. Because number one, Justinian has cut off any sort of inquiry into can we now interrogate this particular position? No. Can we use, I don't know, Greco-Roman thought or Greek philosophy? No. Guess who inherits Greek philosophy? The Muslims, right? So they start taking all of those texts that had been burned, and by the way, this was not something new. Like this is a habit that continued on even right at the starting point of modernity. So when you have Isabella and Ferdinand that come at the end of Muslim Spain, one of the first things they do when they ransack the city is that they say all of the books that are there, put them in a pile and burn them. This was very common. And early Christianity, especially after Justinian, this was common. Like all the books, get rid of them. But the books were preserved by the Muslims. So they came, there was translation efforts within, as you guys know, the House of Wisdom. And those translation efforts caused a type of, intellectual, flourishing, you can say, both in Spain and in the Abbasid Empire. Anyway, and a lot of those ideas eventually come into Europe slowly. So what happens is Europe is in the Dark Ages. There's no sort of intellectual inquiry. There's no sort of activity but people as human beings, as part of our fitrah, we like knowledge. We want to learn things. And who are the people of civilization? Who are the people who are at the peak of civilization at this moment? It's the Muslims. So what you find is people start to travel to Spain, to the Muslim world, and many of them start to leave off Christianity. In fact, one of the bishops writes to some of his contemporaries. He says this has become a major problem. Our people go to the Muslim lands and they don't study the scriptures. They study Arabic. They can speak Arabic and compose poetry better than the Arabs themselves. And they have left off studying our scriptures. So you know how a lot of people say, people coming from abroad, they come to America to study and then they lose their deen or whatever. That phenomenon was switched, right? So now people are going from Europe, with steeped in the Dark Ages, coming to the Muslim world and learning. Now what happens is that all of that learning starts to filter back into Europe. And what you find is that Europe starts to now slowly crawl out of these Dark Ages. Now let me give you some examples of other issues related to the Dark Ages. Number one, it's very well known that in the area of medical sciences, being a quack was very common. In other words, people really didn't have medical knowledge. They would just say things just from themselves. So urine baths became very common. Like if you're having, if you're going through leprosy or something like this, take a urine bath. Okay, but this is just no sort of medical basis, nothing like that. But this was something that was prescribed. With the discovery of the New World, right? By the way, who discovered the New World? What? Did I hear Christopher Columbus? Muslims. Okay, alhamdulillah. I thought I heard Christopher Columbus. I was okay, make tawbah. Anyway, the Muslims did. In fact, there are very interesting documentation of that. So there was a man by the name of Muhammad al-Idrisi in the 12th century who wrote a book, and in this book he outlines or he documents a group of sailors. So he says that these sailors, these Muslim sailors, he said they went off and they sailed westwards, okay? These 8 sailors, he goes, eventually they come to a certain land, and this is documented. You can check me on this, right? Muhammad al-Idrisi, he has a book, it was written in there, it's in there. So he says that these 8 sailors, they go westward, eventually they find land, and the people of that land kidnap them, capture them. Now he says that these 8 sailors, I believe he said it was eight sailors, he says as they were imprisoned, they say we saw something amazing. Because number one, the people that captured us, we don't know what they're saying. They're speaking some language, and obviously these sailors are speaking Arabic. He says, after a little while, a man came and worked as a translator. He started translating. He spoke Arabic and he spoke their language. Okay, stop here for a second. How did this guy learn Arabic? Like wahi? Like what? obviously he had to be there first, right? That's obvious. So he says that this man worked as a translator, negotiated our release, and here's another interesting point, and these people took us back to our ship on canoes. Now, canoes is a very specific, you can say, North American and South American technology, right? And the fact that the way it's shaped and so on and so forth. So my point in mentioning this story, eventually they come back and they narrate this to Muhammad al-Idrisi. My point in mentioning this is that it's well known, well documented that Muslims were here, right? You can even say that there's linguistic documentation of that as well. Some of the cities, we have a city in Texas called Palestine. You'll see cities that are called Mecca and Medina and all, Aqsa, and you'll find it in the U.S., right? So there's plenty of linguistic evidence, documentary evidence. Anyways, this is a tangent that I'm going on, so let me come back. So Europe is in the Dark Ages. They are now going through all this, but now knowledge is starting to come back in. So you're starting to have a tussle between people that want to learn and people that see the oppression of the church itself. Because by this time, the Pope has the right to basically say what is halal and what is haram. Okay? By the way, anyone know of any groups that still follow this type of idea where like an individual has the right to say what is halal and what is haram? The Ismailis, right? The Aghanis, right? They still, their imam still says this is halal, this is haram, right? So anyways, till this day, so he's alive, he's on, you see him with speedboats and all sorts of other things, but that's a separate issue. Anyway, so the Pope has this, and what starts happening is that they start having policies that are quite unjust. They start forcing people into a certain type of belief. People are then persecuted. So if you know about the Inquisition in Spain, this is all part of that sort of punishment which says, look, accept Christianity or else. That's where you have the concept of what they call Moriscos. Does anyone know what Moriscos are? So Moors was a derogatory term that they would use for Muslims, right? Specifically North Africans. Moriscos, once Isabel and Ferdinand take over Spain, right? The people that remained, the poor people, the people that were not wealthy. So the wealthy people were able to leave. They could go to North Africa, they left. The poor people didn't have the means to leave. So the fact that they stayed, they were forced into becoming Christian. But they were Christian externally, but internally they still had Iman, right? And these people were called Moriscos. And they were put in some very difficult tests, right? So they would go to their houses and put like, a leg of pig and say, you have to eat from this pig and show me. So it wasn't that you do your own thing on, in your house. They would come into your house and check, and they'll make you eat pork. They would force you to drink alcohol. Now all of that is fine and great. No, it's not fine and great, but you can stand that, right? But they understood that too. They understood that, okay, these Muslims, they'll drink the alcohol. They'll eat the pig. But now we have to test them even further. So what they started making the Muslims do, or the Moriscos do, even though many of them were said, look, we're Christian, just believe us. They would come to church, they would offer the church services and all of that. But they said, okay, now it's not enough. We want you to curse the Prophet ﷺ. Now look, you can eat the pig, you can drink the alcohol. That's a line many of them couldn't cross. Some of them had to swallow that bitter pill. But some of them were killed because that was like, that's a line we're not going to be able to cross. We won't do it. Anyway, so, and they had other things that they would test Muslims with. Like, if they found out that if Muslims are too clean. I'm serious. Like, they basically, if you're too clean, they'd be like, wait a minute, something's wrong. Because remember, they had those Platonic ideas that were still there. Anything to do with the earth, anything to do with the body, that's to be done away with. So you had, in early Christianity, marital relationships were off. Taking too many showers was considered very earthly. So we're not going to do that either. So if you have these Muslims here that are like clean and they believe in hygiene and all these things, we've now identified them, especially on Jummah. If you showered on Jummah, they got you, right? Anyhow, so continuing on. So now what happens is you have people that are now sensing that the church is becoming oppressive, both from the realm of politically, it's becoming too powerful, and what eventually manifests is what are known as the wars of religion. I think I mentioned them yesterday, okay? Around 1530 to 1630. These war of religions were some of the most brutal and terrible wars where people were trying to fight against the idea of what's known as the divine right of kings. And they're trying to say, we need to now have power in the hands of people, essentially what they're saying. If you were to take three main ideas that were, let's say, extant in Europe, and three ideas that came up after this time period, it would be three. These are the three ideas you want to consider and juxtapose with each other. The idea of God versus the idea of material. The idea of the soul, the ruh, versus the idea of the body. The idea of life after death versus the life of this world. Okay? So it was almost as if there was like a shift from having some sort of focus with these three ideas of God, the soul, and the afterlife, to all of a sudden now the shift being completely to the material world, your body, and the life of this world. Okay? This shift is almost like a reaction to the power of the church. One of the first reactions, or the main reaction that we can point out, is what's known as the Reformation. So the Reformation arises, a man by the name of Martin Luther. How many people have heard of Martin Luther? You've heard of Martin Luther? Okay. So now he actually starts to critique many things that the church was doing. So one kind of corruption in the church, these things were known as indulgences. In other words, they would sell you forgiveness, like an insurance policy to paradise. And when you pay for that, the church would pay for its own, structures and, whatever it might be. So one of his first complaints was against indulgences, that the church has now, gone too far. And so he writes this protest in Germany and hammers it onto a certain church. And that's why Protestants are called Protestants, because of the protest of Martin Luther, FYI, right? So he hammers these on, a number of things that he starts to now say we need to move away from. And a lot of this, and there's a lot of scholarship on this, he was actually influenced by a lot of thought from the Islamic world. Because remember, there is connection between Europe and the Islamic world. It's not like they're completely cut off. So certain ideas that he brings are actually very Islamic. I'll give you a few examples. The idea of what's known as sola scriptura. What does that mean? Well, one of the things that Justinian had implemented is that no one would be allowed to teach the Bible and read the Bible directly. It was only the church that could tell you what the Bible says. Okay? Martin Luther comes up, he translates the Bible into the vernacular, the common vernacular, German, French, whatever it might be. So now it moves from the church will be the interpreter to you as an individual will approach the text and be the interpreter. Now, have we ever had that problem? That there was an institution that tells us this is what you should believe, this is what you should not believe. And they would force you to do it. No. From the very get-go, the Prophet ﷺ, from the very get-go, خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنِ وَأَلَّمَهُ. The best of you is the one who learns the Qur'an and teaches it. So this concept of directly knowing the text, learning it, teaching it, it was what Luther calls sola scriptura, and this is where it gets to translated into the various vernaculars, so people start to directly access the Bible. Number one. Number two, the concept of going through saints. This was something that's very common in the church. But now, when they now enter the Muslim world and they see Muslims making dua to Allah directly, without any intercession, without the need to say, okay, I'm going to do this many, Hail Marys or whatever it might be and seek intercession, this has an impact. And sure enough, it has an impact on Martin Luther as well. So now he adopts this to say, no more saint worship. We're going to cast that aside. And other ideas, right? That he now starts to now, but by the way, he actually commissioned a translation of the Quran, one of the very early translations of the Quran. Not because he loved Islam or anything, but in his mind he thought if we can translate the Quran, people will be able to recognize the falsehood of this quote-unquote heretical religion. Okay? But nevertheless, he had exposure to Islam, right? Clearly we can see the fact that he commissioned a translation of the Quran. Interestingly enough, the Ottoman Empire was actually supporting his work. Now, why would the Ottomans do that? Well, number one, Ottomans were sending in missionaries to Europe to actually call them to Islam. And what they formulated, they said, look, his theology is at least closer to the Islamic theology than Catholicism, right? Or what modern day, what we call Catholicism. So they actually supported him. Many people, when historians write about why Martin Luther's movement became successful, because there are lots of movements, by the way. Martin Luther wasn't the first one to have a protest. Many movements. What Western scholarship says is the main reason why Martin Luther becomes successful is because his protest coincides with the advent of the Gutenberg printing press. Now, instead of handwriting, transcribing everything hand by hand, now you can print out things. And one of the first things that was printed was the Bible. By the way, if you ever go to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., one of the first copies that Gutenberg printed of the Bible is actually there. You can see it. I got a chance to see it myself. So anyways, so what Western academics say is that, well, because the printing press was there, that's what fueled Martin Luther to have a movement that was as dominant as it was. In fact, what they failed to notice was that financially and militarily, there was support from the Ottomans as well. So really, Luther could not have really succeeded and gone very far unless there was help from the Ottomans. Okay? Now, whether that was right or wrong, that's a separate issue we can discuss. Point being, one of the first movements is Protestantism. Protestantism now starts to move people from a state of trusting religious authorities to trusting themselves, right? So they will interpret the Bible for themselves. Okay, what are some of the other effects of this sort of breaking away from the church? Well, number one, remember, we said that there's no concept of law. Once there's no concept of law, and even the Pope and the church doesn't have the right to issue law, now you have to come up with your own law. And so the environment around is where they're now taking legal principles. And so one of the early things that happens, now we're talking about how we're now moving into modernity, and we're talking about before the Enlightenment, one of the very early results of Protestantism is that one of the earlier thinkers by the name of Calvin, he now, in discussing the concept of interest-bearing transactions. So in the church, by and large, interest-bearing transactions were considered haram, right? Like forbidden. And there's evidence of this. There's verse in the Bible where, that you had like these, the Jewish rabbis, they had a certain currency that they would use in the temple, and you had the Roman currency. And so what they would tell people, they say, look, if you want to give sadaqah, you have to use the temple currency. You can't use the stained currency of the Romans, because they're polytheists, they worship idols. You have to use pure currency, and we are the only ones that can give you that currency. But what do you think they did? Do you think there was a one-on-one transaction? No way, right? So they said, give us 5 shekels and we'll give you whatever, 3 of these. And so they started making money like this. Jesus, and this is a passage in the Bible, when he sees this, typically when you think the biblical Jesus, you don't think of someone who is overly angry. You don't think of someone who's going to be like just kind of just getting really upset. You think of someone who's like spiritual, someone who's very calm, kind, and so on. Even from our own tradition, we know this, right? This is one of the first and maybe the only time, I don't know exactly, that you find that Isa alayhi salam is depicted as being extremely angry. And he starts shouting at them because you have made the temple into a den of thieves. And he takes the table and he flips the table over, right? Of these priests or whatever, of these rabbis that were doing these transactions. So from this, and by the way, in the Bible it says, and this is where they decided to get rid of him, right? So it's when he said interest is wrong, that's when they said, not this guy, right? We got to figure out something to do with him. Anyway, so up until Calvin, interest-bearing transactions, if not completely forbidden, were looked down upon. But now at the time of Calvin now says, hold on a second, interest is nothing more than rent on money. You pay rent for your house, you pay rent for things. Why can't you pay rent on money? But what is the effect of this? It opens up a type of financing that allows eventually a domination of the world by way of colonialism. Why does it do that? How does it do that? Well, let's just briefly take a look at how that functions. When you have a certain limited amount of money and you want to now, let's say, start a business. Now, typically in business, for anyone here a business major? No business majors. Yeah, I thought you were a dentist. So, okay. All right, khalas. Businessman, dentist, da'iya, mashallah. Okay, anyway. So, in business, you know that typically when you want to finance an operation, you can do it by way of debt or you can do it by way of equity. Okay, so debt is you're going to borrow money from someone and you're going to pay that money back. Equity means you're going to give someone a share of your business. Okay, by and large, I'm making it as simple as I can. Okay, the issue with debt is that you take debt and you have to give the debt back, right? But if you're able to now have an interest-bearing debt, what you can do now is that you can actually make money from nothing. How so? When banks first came to the scene, what they would do is you would have gold as the standard. In other words, people would use gold to transact. Now, gold is an actual thing. You have to dig for it in the ground. So there's a limited amount of gold. But what would happen is people would deposit their gold with goldsmiths. Now, so someone came up with the idea and they said, look, instead of us carrying on our gold, we'll give it to the goldsmith. He's working with it anyway. And the goldsmith would give a receipt. Now, this receipt, instead of now saying, you know what, I need to buy some popcorn, I'm going to go back to the goldsmith, give him the receipt, get the gold out, carry the gold, here you go, get some popcorn. All right, that's really, you know what? Why don't you know the goldsmith, I know the goldsmith, just take the receipt. And so comes about paper money, right? Because people, instead of transacting with gold, now they're just using the receipts to transact. And this becomes quite common. Now, the goldsmiths themselves, the people, we'll call them bankers, the bankers said, you know what? If people are really just using, these receipts in currency, we can lend these receipts out. So initially they would say, okay, we have, let's say, I'll use contemporary currency, $10 of gold, we're going to issue $10 notes. But now they said, no one really comes around to claim their gold. So what we can do is we can issue $20. But notice there's only gold of $10 in what they have. And so we start on this concept of creating money out of nothing. All right? And this is a ribawi transaction. Now, what happens when you disconnect an actual real thing from what's being used as money? Now you can literally print money. And so what happens is that because you now have access to all of this money, now you can start a process of industrialization that gets accelerated because you have a lot of cash to work with, a lot of capital. Capital becomes very easy. Okay, that's one result. The second thing is, going back to Europe, there are certain philosophies that are being developed. One of those philosophies is what we call liberalism, as a political philosophy. This philosophy basically puts freedom and liberty front and center. Okay? Now, I don't have time to get into all the details about how liberalism comes up, but understand that we are still living under the worldview of liberalism. When we talk about concepts like equality and freedom, these are rooted in the concept of liberalism. Because so the term itself has actually evolved. So liberty, at the time of, during Christian Europe, it meant to be free, but to be free from your lower base desires. A type of tazkiyatun nafs, right? To free yourself from that. And that was something that was very common. Because remember, they had that Platonic idea of having higher ideals. So this liberty meant for them, those base desires that you have, to eat, to sleep, to drink, to free yourself, that's what liberty was. But once you have philosophers and the Enlightenment come about, the definition of liberty starts to now evolve, or I guess you can say devolve, if you want to call it that way. And it starts to change. Now it wasn't to be free from your base desires, it was to be free, and in fact it was the opposite, to do whatever you want, to completely submit to your base desires. Now remember, I said there were three concepts that were juxtaposed with each other. We had God and the material world. What happens is, as Enlightenment philosophers start to come and they see the results of the church, they say the concept of God is unimportant. So it's irrelevant whether you believe in God or not, so we'll cast that aside and focus on the material world. Concept number 2, the soul. Whether you have a soul or not, we can't see it, taste it, touch it, feel it. There's no way to empirically know whether you have a soul, so we'll cast that aside and hyper-focus on physical well-being, the body. And finally, the afterlife. We can't empirically test the afterlife. How are we supposed to know? So we will now focus on this world. With the philosophy of liberalism, which puts freedom as its main ethic, now you start finding that the church goes away. The concepts of God, the concepts of the soul, and the concepts of the life of the hereafter are cast aside, and now those other three concepts are basically hyper-focused. You add to that the ability to finance operations by way of money, because Calvin now has said, you know what, interest-bearing transactions are okay. Now you find that this project starts where not only they become a powerhouse, but now they become a colonial power. And they start to now go off into the rest of the world. Okay? This power, where does it come from? Well, like I said, because they had left off interest-bearing transactions, or they adopted interest-bearing transactions, because they put freedom as the only ethic. A lot of times people say, the Muslim world is so backward. How come we don't do science? Right? There's so much ahead of us. Well, the reason why they're ahead of us is because they did not have certain ethical confines that the Muslims do. Under a Muslim rubric, you couldn't now justify the creation of a nuclear bomb that can now decimate large sections of the earth. So you have a limitation. You still have concepts of God, the soul, and the afterlife. They don't. The only thing that they need to worry about is, does this impute on freedom? And how can we maximize freedom? So now they start on a project to conquer the natural world. Why? Because we have to maximize freedom. If that's the only ethic, then they can take care of natural resources. They don't have to worry about how they're using them, how they're experimenting on animals, and so on and so on and so forth. The earth becomes open game. And so for those of you who know about conservatives, that's why the whole free market thing is very prominent amongst conservatives, right? Progressives have a different idea of how to leave off the natural world and have freedom. They went a step further and said, well, not only should we have freedom and the natural world should serve us and increase our freedom, but we also should have freedom from our very bodies, like reality itself. That's why you have concepts like, transgenderism and so on and so forth. The idea is now it's not only freedom in the sense of expanding it and the natural world, but that includes the human body as well. Anyway, so what is the result after all of this? The result is now, where are we in terms of our society? We're in major trouble. Let's go back to the finances. What have the finances done? They've caused immense income inequality. I was mentioning this in the khutbah today, that one of the indications of the downfall of an empire or the downfall of a civilization, when you look at Ibn Khaldun or you look at Sir John Glubb, which I was mentioning in khutbah, one of the indications is income inequality. The fact that we have interest-bearing transactions has fueled income inequality like never before. Number 2, you have societies that are breaking down at the family level. When you have concepts like, let's say, same-sex, actions and transgenderism, this is actually an attack on the central concept of the family. So familial structures are breaking down. So the family is now breaking down. Once you now hyper focus on the world, this has a profound impact on a person and their psychology. Correct? Because now it's like, well, what does all of this mean? A lot of people get into nihilism. It's all just meaningless. Suicide rates start to now, go through the roof, especially in certain northern European countries, because it all just seems meaningless. Economically, socially, psychologically. Ba'san shadid. Right? Remember we started with that? The after effects of war when we were talking about Surah Al-Kahf. So all of this, where was the source? It was the deviation of how Christianity comes about from pure Tawheed. So if that's the point, if that's what we're talking about, what is the solution? Islam, right? That's the only thing that can save where we are in this period within humanity. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, open it up for Q&A, inshallah. How much time do we have left, by the way? As long as I want. This is my master's thesis. So yani, we could be here till my flight. No, I want to be courteous. I'm going to stop here. There's a lot more that I could say, but I wanted to kind of open it up for Q&A, give you guys the opportunity, inshallah. I am hoping to eventually publish that thesis as a book. The only problem is when you write things in academia, you have to write it in very academic language. I don't know why they do that, but it becomes inaccessible, right? To people that want to just read about the topics. So I actually have to, in a sense, translate it into the vernacular. So yes, inshallah, I'll go ahead and stop there. Any questions, inshallah? I know that was a lot to digest, and I was kind of going all over the place. But if you have any questions, that's great. Or like I said last night, I can ask you guys questions. You want me to ask you guys questions? All right. So is last night game as well? Can I ask you from both? Not you. I know you will be able to answer it. So in this dynamic that we just spoke about, since I'm asking questions now, when I say, okay, Islam is the only way out, what do you think, or what role do you think that you need to play in your community to make that a reality? So what do you think? Okay, da'wah. Wonderful, right on point. What else? Just da'wah? Practicing Islam. Okay, very good. What else?
I was going to say set an example.
Setting an example. I will mention kind of one other thing. You see, as we start moving forward, you will find that a lot of pressure is going to come upon us. All right? So for some of the older folks in the audience, they remember what happened after 9/11. And I remember that too. There was a lot of pressure that came about, and it was very easy to capitulate on your morals. We have to make sure we don't do that. We have to stick to those morals, right? And it's going to be tough. I hope not, inshallah. May Allah make it easy for all of us. But when the pressure comes, one of the main things, I know we say practicing Islam, but practicing Islam such that we're not going to capitulate in any way. Because remember, society around us is looking for a way out. They are in the midst of this ba'san shadid, right? They're in the middle of the after effects of this war. And if they are seeing you and you are slipping, you are giving in, you are acquiescing, then where else are they going to turn? I was doing a talk at a conference, and we were talking about the issue of Gaza and so on and so forth. And I remember, I mentioned the hadith of Thu'ban where he says that, that the nations will gather upon you, right? As if people eating from a plate, and the Sahaba asked, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this hadith, right? And so, the Sahaba asked, will we be, less on that day, small in number on that day? And the Prophet said, no, bal antum kathir, right? You will be much, you'll be many in that day, right? But you will be like the froth in the ocean. And Allah will take the fear out of your enemies' hearts and cast in your heart al-wahn. They said, okay, what is al-wahn? He said, hubb dunya wa karahiyatul maut. It is a love for this world and a hatred for death. So I was at this conference and I mentioned this hadith and I said, look, I want to speak to the physicians. If you want to do really bad fundraising, target physicians. Anyways, so I said, I want to talk to the physicians in the audience. Where were you guys when this society needed moral leadership in the domain of transgenderism? When you had young children that were given chemical castrants, right? That you give pedophiles in prison, those same those things used as chemical castrants, they were given to children as puberty blockers. When these children are now funneled into having surgery that will alter their very biology, when they won't be able to have children, and 20 years from now, they're going to ask, who were the people that stood up for us? There were doctors that did stand up. They lost their license. They lost their houses. They lost their money. Where were the Muslims? They're going to ask that question. Hubbu dunya wa karahiyatul maut. What's the worst that's going to happen to you, man? The worst that's going to happen to you is you will die. Worst, right? And if you die, where are you going? Who are you going back to? You are going back to a generous Lord. So what are you worried about, man? Like what's the impediment? So anyways, mind you that I don't think they really liked me very much after that. So I won't be doing fundraising there. But anyway. Sure, okay, bismillah.
So you say Islam is a solution, but then like students go to college, everyone feels like they have to take loans with interest. Same thing with the house. Everyone thinks they have to use interest to buy a house.
Right.
It's become so normalized. The school curriculum, even Muslim schools, they don't talk about any, like even transgender or any of these topics because they want to make sure they're politically correct with it.
Sure.
So there's so many of these topics. A typical Muslim, what would you advise them in these situations to be able to say, well, Islam is a solution, but then they're like, they can't practice most of it.
Sure. So like I said, it's a good question. So like I said, there's going to be a lot of pressure, right? It's very easy to capitulate and say, well, Sheikh so-and-so gave an opinion to say that I can go take student loans. Yeah, okay, that's fine. The harder route is to say, you know what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has declared war, right? And take notice of a war from Allah and His messengers. A messenger. For those who take interest-bearing transactions. Allah has destroyed riba. Yamhaqullahu riba wa yurbis sadaqat. Allah causes riba to be destroyed and sadaqah to grow. Now that's very serious. What other, sin has a declaration of war? So it's not something light. Look, I'm not going to knock you if you want to take the opinion or whatever it is. But there are plenty of people that don't take loans and they're not even Muslim. They say, you know what? We won't graduate in 4 years. Because this becomes a part of culture, right? Like your parents need you to graduate in 4 years. And part of it has to do with parents, right? If you don't graduate in 4 years, that's it, khalas. Leave the house or whatever. But some people, they say, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to graduate. I'll take 6 years. I'll take 8 years. But I don't want to have any debt. So they'll work and they'll graduate and they'll go through it. But that seems that's an untenable position. We'll be too old. Why is that not a position that's acceptable? It's part of our culture as well, right? You have to graduate. Who said you have to graduate? Who made that rule? The second thing about buying houses. Who made the rule that you have to buy a house? Well, brother, you have to have equity and, it's like wasting money. How is it? If you rented for the rest of your life, that's one thing less to worry about when you're going to be facing Allah, right? Because if you know about home financing, there's a number of things you have to worry about. And especially when you have a mortgage. It's not easy. Look, there are people that pass away, they have mortgages. It is, dealing with what happens after all of that, with the inheritance and things like that, it's a nightmare. And I'm always wondering, I'm like, what will be this person's state in the grave? If you can get a house and you can have someone, and by the way, Muslims are working for solutions. It's not like, okay, Muslims are just completely blind to this. There are Muslims who have come together as people who bring equity together that will buy the house outright for you and sell it back to you. It's a halal transaction. It's not a lot. It's happening a little bit in California, a few places in Texas, but there are organizations that started to do that. Why not come up with solutions like that? Why are we so limited? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given, just in this audience, there are people here that I've spoken to, extremely bright, extremely intelligent, extremely capable. But we shoot ourselves in the foot, right? We have the potential. I will say even this, like on a political level, this might get me in trouble, but I'm leaving tomorrow morning, so, you know. But even on a political level, when you think about, you know, everyone kind of, when they think politics, all they think about is voting. It's like we have this binary, vote, not vote. Haram, halal, voting, halal. Hold on a second. Why are we stuck just in voting? There are other means by which you can influence what's going on halfway across the world, for instance, in Gaza. I'll give you one idea that someone came up with, and I think it's a good idea. They said if you took all the politicians that take donations from AIPAC, you guys don't know what AIPAC is, right? If you made a list and start to target those politicians so that they would be penalized, the more funds they take, the more penalized they will be. We'll have campaigns specifically against those politicians. So the more money they take, the more we'll have focus. Why? Because some people said, look, there's a big Jewish lobby. We need to have a lobby too. A, I don't know if we can compete monetarily. B, I don't know if we have that kind of unity. And C, is it really a good use of money? Right? Lobbying. But there are people that are now starting to think out of the box. Can we now have a process by which we target AIPAC, whoever's getting the majority of donations, and we start saying, those are the people we'll vilify, we'll have campaigns, you have social media, you have campaigns to go off and rally Muslims behind that and non-Muslims behind that. There's plenty of non-Muslims that are not really interested in supporting the genocide that's going on in Gaza right now. Plenty. So a lot of these things are not necessarily about, man, what do we do? It's really tough. We have human capital. We have intelligent people, right? And I'm seeing it right now. MashaAllah, Allahumma barik, right? So it's about coming together and kind of thinking out of the box with a lot of these issues. There are organizations that now help students with they give student loans as well, and interest free. Yes, they have certain conditions. They say, look, if you could and you come back, you help us raise money for other students. So they'll come back as testimonials, say, look, I got these funds. And many students have had their whole schooling paid for by some of these organizations. I think it's called a continuous charity. Yeah? Yeah. And yeah, it's not a huge organization, but at least it's a step in the right direction. Anyways, I need to get off my soapbox. Any other questions? No other questions. All right. Yes. Okay, how do we learn Islam? Yes, I agree. So, that's an interesting question. So, how do we learn Islam? And YouTube videos are not enough. I actually have a big issue with people learning Islam from YouTube videos. Okay? And again, I'm leaving tomorrow, so I can say this. One of the things that I was thinking about, and I'll come to your question in just a second. One of the things I was thinking about is that, there are hadith which talk about the lifting of knowledge, right? And the Prophet ﷺ mentions that the knowledge, there'll come a time when knowledge will be lifted. But how will it be lifted? It's bimautul ulama wa kathratul juhala. It is by the death of scholars and the proliferation of ignorant people. So when you start looking at scholars that have died, you see a lot of good scholars have passed away. And kathratul juhala, like the proliferation of ignorant people, I would say that's your quintessential influencer. And no, okay, I'm not knocking all influencers. Some people are, they're good at what they do. They're able to give knowledge. But if you really think about it, what kind of qualifications do people on YouTube really have? In any domain. Like people are like, you know what? I like cooking. I will start a cooking channel. Okay, the guy may have never cooked anything in his life, right? Look at my experiment. And then all of a sudden he's got followers and all this other stuff. Okay, and that's just cooking. Imagine people taking their deen from people like that, we don't know where they're from, what their qualification is. Maybe they speak really well and that's it, right? One of the things that Sapience always attacks me for, not attack, I shouldn't say attacks, that's a bit rough. They criticize me for is that I don't have enough online presence, right? Anyways, that's a separate issue. But coming back to your question, all right? So we don't want to take stuff from YouTube as a proper learning track. What do we do? Well, I would say starting off with what you can do locally on site. Okay? So you have Sheikh Hassan here. I'm assuming you guys have programs, right? There's programs you can come to, right? And I'm sure these programs are I'm putting, Sheikh Hassan under the gun now, and he's like, I don't know about that. But I'm assuming you have programs where you're able to like learn your deen. The reason why I say that on site is important is because for us, when we think about learning, it's not just gathering information. For us, there's a much more deeper understanding of what we're learning, and in the sense that part of our experiential knowledge is part of learning. When you're in the company of a scholar, that sohbah, that company, that is going to influence you too. It's just something that you're not going to get online and you're not going to get on YouTube. But taking in the adab, taking in, they say that al-adabu qabla talab, right? That adab comes before seeking knowledge. So for us, it's not just how much information can I gather. Because look, you can learn things in an abstract way. But it's only when you become what you learn that it has any sort of significance. Like I could tell you everything there is, all the nutrition that you need to follow, all of the workouts you need to do in order to get a six-pack. Okay, let me just bluntly state here, I do not have a six-pack. Okay? Because there's abstract knowledge and then there's actually implementing the knowledge, right? So my point is that why I kind of stress that if there are things that are going on here at TMC, I mean, you have a resource right here, right? And if it's not there, well, get on Sheikh Hassan's case and tell him, look, man, we need more programming. At which point he may tell you we need more funding, and then put you under the gun. But that would be my advice, really. If you can find something on site, take advantage of that. Especially there's people that are teaching things that are, more long term, like a course on tazkiyatun nafs, a course on aqidah, whatever it might be, whatever resources you have, and try to focus on that. That would be my advice. Yes, there are online universities and things like that, and sure, but I've always been a big proponent because perhaps it's affected me as well. I know it's a big difference between some of the mashayikh that I studied with directly versus, people that I may learn from in terms of like reading books, right? Or, let's say online or whatever it might be. There's just, it's a huge difference because it shapes you in a way that, YouTube and online doesn't. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. All right, let's do one last question. Actually, we'll do two last questions because I know the sister had her hand up, so I'll come back to you. Yes?
How do you draw a line between tolerance and, like, up to where do you tolerate people for who they are, and then say that we're against the LGBTQ?
Okay, so how do you tolerate? What is the line of tolerance? Well, obviously, we're not people that kind of, we're not going to be going around spitting on people, right? That's not the idea. And this happens more like we have to treat everyone with respect. It doesn't matter what their disposition is. So those aren't things, I'm not saying you're now, capitulating on your morals. Part of our morals is to treat everyone with respect, right? To not hold that against them. And actually look at, and the thing is, how do you view a person? Right? From one perspective, you could be like, oh, this person is part of this, this LGBTQ ideology that's trying to dominate us and overtake our families and destroy us. Or you could say, you know what? This person needs Islam. And I need to speak to them in a way that I can understand that, you know what? They have identified themselves with something that has to do with something that's very, shallow. Like who you want to have marital relations with is essentially what they've identified themselves with. Which, when you think about that and you introduce the concept of Allah, the divine, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, you want to move this person from identifying themselves to say, I am this thing, from saying, you're better than that. You're more than that. You can identify with the creator of the heavens and the earth. You can identify with Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Quddus, As-Sabur, and so on and so forth. And kind of having that sort of compassion for them. A lot of times what happens is, and actually it's not a lot of times, this has changed now, but in the early days, if someone were to walk into the masjid and say, I think I'm gay, I mean, they would just, like takfir would be flying right and left, right? Like he left Islam, But you have, even amongst Muslims, people that go through what we call SSA, same-sex attraction, and they're really struggling with it, And if we're gonna not have kind of that vantage point of compassion, I mean, where are they supposed to go? Like, there's a very good podcast called "A Way Beyond the Rainbow," and it's by a person that was struggling with SSA and was able to come back to Islam. It's an excellent podcast. But like, you go to season 5, He actually, it's really good. So one of the things that he mentioned was that, because of the position I take to say I still want to be obedient to Allah, I want to worship Allah, I consider same-sex actions as sins. He said one of the things that was just really heartbreaking. He says, I'm ostracized in both communities. So from the LGBTQ community, I'm considered an outcast. I'm considered someone who just sold himself out, a self-hating person. From the Muslim community, I'm considered, this guy's a fasiq, right? He's like, he's this and that. He goes, so really, it's a very lonely place to be in. So you've got to be able to sympathize with people, right? At the same time, we don't capitulate, right? And I know this is going to go to like, what do you call your coworker and should you address him by their pronouns? That's a tough question. I don't know if I can really answer that. I can tell you this, and maybe because we live in Texas and you guys have the advantage of living in Florida. My wife, she teaches at a public high school. She's U.S. history, 11th grade. And her first experience with this, she came home to me and she said, Fahad, guess what happened today? I'm like, what? She goes, I had this student in my class, her name's Linda, and she came to me and she said, look, Miss Sayed, I want you to, on Monday, I'd like you to address me as he. On Tuesday, I'd like you to address me as she. And on Wednesday, they. And she said, I looked at her and I'm like, I'm going to call you Linda. Right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and play, juggling your pronouns. It's like ridiculous. And she was like, but don't tell my parents. Now, legally, she can't tell her parents, which, by the way, is very problematic, right? And to kind of usurping that kind of information from parents, even at a young age, I mean, that's kind of a type of, oppression of children. I don't know what is, right? But anyway, so she told me that, she said we started getting more and more of these cases, but the fact that we live in Texas, all of her coworkers are totally on board with her, right? And so they're always like, yeah, we don't deal with that. We just tell them like, no, we'll just call you by your name. So they really like, they're just, because of the culture there, So it's a tough question though. I know some people, they have jobs, they work in employment, and they're told, that they might risk losing their job. It's a tough spot to be in. I wish I had kind of a clear-cut answer to say this is what you'll always do, but it's going to depend situation to situation, and Allah knows best. By the way, all my wife's coworkers also go to the gun range. Women, yani, So anyway, we love our guns. Yes.
Nowadays we have like a community called Free Thinkers.
Free thinkers. Okay.
You know what is happening in India, right?
Mm-hmm.
The BJP, RSS. And all.
Yes.
So for them, the biggest threat is the Muslim.
Of course.
Somehow they want to break this ideology.
Yes.
So what they do, they come to the very influential state
Yeah.
where there are more Muslims around,
Mm-hmm.
pump in a lot of money to create the free thinkers.
I see.
Free thinker is like creating an atheist,
Sure.
and where they are specifically targeting the Muslims. They want the Muslims to become the atheists,
Right.
so that they know when Muslims stand for something, they stand really strong.
Yeah. Of course.
Even in this group,
That scares them. Yeah.
yes. So the atheists are there right now. That has been spread around, and we have many. And when they interact with your family, what impact will these kind of atheists will have on their children? Because how can they corrupt the mind of the children?
Very easily. So this is, and if you take the full No Doubt course, it's actually one of the strategies is to kind of be aware and ignore, right? And what I mean by that is that a lot of these atheists, they'll come online, and especially ex-Muslims, right? And I always find it really interesting is why do they still have to attach the term Muslim to their name, right? It's like, okay, khalas, you left now, right? Just leave it alone. But yes, they have to be known. They have to still be associated with Islam. Anyway, so they would come on, and their whole purpose is just to spread, shubuhat, just to spread doubts. Now, the issue is that a young person would be like, well, I can handle this. But the issue is that a lot of times you may not be able to handle it. So one of the strategies we say is like, look, you're not going to jump into a shark-infested water, right? Unless you have the equipment to deal with the sharks, right? So in the same way, you have to be very careful with kind of where your children are online. You can't just, trust like, YouTube Kids or something. You'll find a lot of these videos are even on YouTube Kids. They're specifically targeting kids. And so yeah, you have to be careful with that, especially with your children. I mean, you have to kind of cut down screen time, and it's hard. I mean, the easiest thing to do as a parent is just be like, here you go, you know, and then that's it. But it's a harder path, but it's necessary, right? And then have those conversations with your kids as well. Just be open with them. You know, one of the things that, you know, with my own children, when they were young, is that I would have these very open and frank conversations with them, because it was everywhere anyway. Like speaking about the LGBTQ thing, I mean, you turn on NPR and they'd be like, oh, we're, you know, gay, gay marriage rights and so on and so forth, and it's being legalized. And then, you know, my son would ask like, Baba, what's gay marriage? You know, now one option would be like, don't worry about that, when he was very young, and the other option is, well, he's hearing it on the radio, so I'd rather him hear it from me rather than hear it from, you know, Joe Schmo in even Islamic school. By the way, Islamic schools are not immune. You know, just because you put a kid in this, is that true? Right, Sheikh Hassan? Just because you put a kid in Islamic school doesn't mean he's completely immune. He will never hear anything about anything, right? So yeah, to be very careful, coming back to what you were saying, if, you know, these people are online, they are quite popular as influencers, and so you have to be really careful, you know, and screen time is something that I think is, you have to really, you know, delay that as much as you possibly can. There's another phenomena that's happening in the US called delayed adolescence. Actually, I think it's in the Western world in general, and they started to say that there's this, you know, kind of maturity. The age is being, even though a person may have, like, let's say, you know, sexual maturity, but mental maturity is just being pushed higher and higher and higher. So, you know, a 19-year-old today may be compared to like a 13 or 12-year-old 10, 20, 30 years ago, you know. And you can see that in society, and a lot of that has to do with kind of screen time. You know, how much time that people are spending on screens. There was an interesting study that it was done out of MIT, and they compared writing samples from the 1960s to writing samples of 2012. This is when the study was done, and they looked at the writing samples of 2012, and they said that the writing was very disjointed. It was all over the place, you know, compared to that from the 1960s. And so when they started to now inquire, like, why is it that why has it depreciated to such a degree, they realized is that people couldn't focus as much. So in the 60s, you didn't really have distractions. You could sit down and just write, you know, an entire essay. Now it's like you're gonna write a paragraph and then ding, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna check my phone. And then you come back and then you have to like recalibrate everything. So the quality of essay writing itself has really decreased, a lot of that having to do with screens. So, you know, one of the things that I usually advocate in Ramadan is don't only have a fast from like eating and drinking, have a screen fast as well. You know, have some time, just say, you know what, I'm going to put it aside and I'm going to focus on the Quran. So, all right, I think that we hit 9:30. We'll go ahead and call it an evening. Jazakumullahu khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you, bless your families, increase you in khair, and grant you the best of this dunya and the best of the akhirah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu wa la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa jazakumullahu khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.